back. For those of you, I'm sure, who are aware, the editor and founder of Counteroffensive. This is one of Substack's only war correspondents exclusively dedicated newsletters. You're in Ukraine, specifically in Kyiv. You are also a former U.S. Army medic, but you have broken stories that are so central to Russian disinformation around the world. Very valuable right here to Ukrainians. And I also would just like to say that I particularly enjoy all of your posts that begin with Kyiv is in the hands of Ukrainian control every day. So I thank you for that. Chris Alexander, the Honorable Chris Alexander, former MP for Ajax Pickering, former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration for Canada, former Parliamentary Secretary for National Defence, and the former Ambassador of Canada to Afghanistan. Thank you for joining us. And the foreign editor of the Globe and Mail, Angela Murphy, also professor of journalism and never more needed right now at the University of Guelph and Humber. So we thank you so much, Angela, for joining us. So we have only an hour for this discussion. I will break it up into 4 parts, the last of which will hopefully be time for audience questions. We're going to kick it off with taking the temperature here in Canada and what the current state of exposure to propaganda is in arts and culture and journalism. We'll start with you, Angela. Cinema, I think, probably shocks a lot of people, especially Western audiences, with the overtness, the capital P, so to speak, of propaganda messages. But disinformation and propaganda takes all form now. Can you talk to us a little bit about soft propaganda, misinformation, what it looks like today, and how you encounter it?
Sure. So I mostly, almost exclusively work in news and not arts. But what I have seen a lot of, especially in the recent months of the US election, is a lot of video content that's being produced, misinformation particularly about the Democrats, because it seemed quite clear that, to us anyway, that Russia was supporting the Republican campaign by trying to undermine Kamala Harris, who they had a video that was supposedly in Georgia where migrants apparently were voting for her multiple times to inspire distrust in the electoral process. That video was traced back to a Russian source by American security agencies like the FBI. There was another one that accused the vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, of being a pedophile, and by a former student, which I believe was also traced back to a Russian source. So, I mean, that's been my experience of what I've been seeing just in the last few months. And it's been pretty blatant, right up to Election Day, where I'm sure you guys are aware that there were fake bomb threats at several of the polling stations in the United States that were, again, somewhat traced back. Like, I haven't actually seen all of the evidence yet, but the FBI did say that there was a Russian VPN address involved. So, and it's not unusual because the same thing happened recently in Moldova and other places. So that's what I've been seeing. I'm not an expert on it, but it's out there enough that it's being reported on by many media outlets.
So there we have the Canadian perspective of what's happening. Tim Mack, you're situated in Kyiv. You're with journalists from Ukraine and with Ukrainians. Can you talk to us a little bit about the state of propaganda messages? Are Ukrainians able to call it out? Are the media calling out in situ there? Is there even the bandwidth for that conversation while covering the war?
Well, the insidious fact of Russian disinformation is that Russian propaganda is often not as cartoonish as we see in the messages that they display to their domestic population. Their foreign disinformation is much less about patriotism and nationalism and doing what is right than it is to throwing everything that they can at the wall and seeing what will stick. What's happened in the United States, what's happening in Ukraine right now, is not that the Russian disinformation takes one particular message, like we saw in this documentary, and promotes it. It takes all possible messages in the most radical way. What we saw in 2016, what we saw in 2020, what we saw in 2024 in the United States, is that Russian disinformation is less concerned about what is the right outcome and more concerned with promoting radicalism on all sides. So in 2016, for example, subsequent Senate inquiries found that Russian propagandists tried to create violent protests on both sides of any given issue. This is a similar thing that you might see happen in Ukraine as well. And this is the very disconcerting thing about Russia when it comes outside of Russia, which is they're not particularly interested in promoting a particular ideology. What they want to do is create as much chaos as possible. They want to instill violence, anger, make us feel out of control, make us feel like there's no action that we can take except for attacking other people, beating other people, violently protesting. They want people to feel helpless from whatever ideological perspective they originally come from.
That's such a significant nuance to discuss about propaganda that originates from within Russia, from without Russia. Chris Alexander, Global Affairs Canada, to bring it back to Canadian shores, it specifically states that Russia is using non-traditional assets, including state media, to sow disruption and support its hostile activities on an international scale, including in Canada. And it just so happens that we are speaking on the heels of so many stories that are breaking in this arena. Are these disruptions, are they outliers, or are we more, in your opinion, in a flashpoint position of sensitivity to propaganda right now?
The sensitivity is growing. We are now, government agencies are starting to pick up these initiatives to influence public opinion, to, as Tim says, disorient, radicalize, polarize public opinion in our countries more than they used to. And this is thanks to hard experience. In the US election in 2016, we only started discussing in a serious way afterwards what the Russian hand might have been in Facebook groups and Facebook ads, which no one saw at the time, including, I think, law enforcement, except for the people they were meant for in the counties and the demographies that the Russians were targeting. We went many years, certainly in the Trump administration, doing nothing about this. There was the Mueller report and a few other imperfect exercises in trying to come to grips with it. It's really only been in recent years that the G7 is talking about it in a more concerted way, that our intelligence security agencies, which had really migrated their focus over to the threat of terrorism, including homegrown terrorism and extremism in our countries, as well as in Canada's case, in other cases to some extent China, Russia was kind of the third threat, or even lower on the list. Now it's coming back up the list, which is good, because this has been with us for at least a decade. And I think the hardened experts in this field would agree that Russia is the most prolific, even today, producer of disinformation and propaganda for that purpose. The Center for Hybrid Threats in Finland has a great expert who says that it's about 60%. I think his name is Jakub Kalinski. Globally, of global disinformation and propaganda, and there are a lot of states doing it. He attributes 60% to Russia, with China, Iran, and others further down the list. So we're still mapping out what the shape of this is. And here in this film, we see Russian cultural propaganda, film, first and foremost. There is also a news machine in Russia that started even earlier to zombify the Russian population, to give really sophisticated propaganda every day. And we've all met these people in Toronto and elsewhere who watch Russian television and believe these myths about these lies about Nazis and so forth. Then, after the war in Georgia, where Margarita Simonyan, the head of RT, famously said, we lost the information war outside of Russia after 2008. They stepped up their game, active measures, propaganda, disinformation in our country. And how did they do it? Lots of different ways. Now they're doing it through cultural institutions and organizations because of sanctions. But the main channel they've had is social media. And the growth of social media, spectacular growth, which weakened our legacy journalism, the business model of journalism, coincided with that move that they made 2008, 9, 10 to invest heavily in dominating a big part of ex-Twitter, Meta, Facebook, YouTube, and they wield that like a weapon.
Richard Fadden, the former director of CSIS, is in really a landmark statement, I think, has made this comment. If you think naively that the Russians don't care as much about influencing Canadian thought, penetrating the Canadian government at all levels, I'm here to tell you they care deeply about shaping how you think, how you vote, and sowing chaos and discord. When I first read this in recent media, I was taken aback to times studying in Ukrainian school, in Canadian high schools, the time of Cold War. This sounds archaic, it sounds absolutely from another time. And I think perhaps that naivete that he refers to would surprise a lot of Canadians who are perhaps being exposed for the first time to this new raft of a social media, small p, propaganda. So I just want to have that kept in mind, that this audience is mainly composed, well, actually I don't know, but it is composed of many Ukrainians, but of Western thinkers who the images tonight would be completely shocking to because it is so thoroughly overt. So I think it's important in this discussion to kind of have that duality of thought that this is not so recent history, and we are living in times that, even as we said in this week, are drastically changing the look, the visualization of what propaganda, disinformation can be. To take us to the second part of the discussion, can subjectivity and objectivity coexist when you're documenting war? I think journalism, narrative journalism, the kind that you specialize in, Tim, documentaries are on one side, and then you've got news stories and official releases and statements on another. I think personal journeys and documentaries are especially vulnerable to this type of critical lens, where many would say that is the new arena of discussion. These TikTok videos, these self-proclaimed experts, this personal experience is now guiding the historical narrative because it can be so accessible to all of us on that human level. I think, Tim, you are specifically well positioned to talk about this, given that the counteroffensive is dedicated very much to narrative journalism, to talking about that personal experience and those personal stories. I'm wondering if you could talk to us about your approach, personally and professionally, to covering and addressing that propaganda and misinformation, especially when it is a part of people's lived experience, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, let's take a step back and take a look at the documentary that we just saw. And, you know, and I think a lot of people in the audience, their reaction to it would have been just how cartoonish some of this absurd
seems impossible
propaganda was. And why do we have that kind of reaction to this? Why did this sort of propaganda fail in the 20th century? Why did the Soviet Union's propaganda fail? Why did fascist propaganda fail? There's a certain absurdity around it, which we can kind of laugh at as free people. And the reason we can laugh at it is because it lacks a genuine authenticity and a connection with the way we live our lives. The absurd, cartoonish depictions of Ukrainians in this propaganda, well, everyone in this room knows that it's ridiculous. The absurd, ridiculous portrayals of Russia as an honorable state that's trying to go out and protect other people from NATO advances or atrocities, I think everyone in this room knows, does not connect with the reality and facts of the world that we live in. And so, what is the antidote? So, you know, the counteroffense, the publication we run, tries to go as deeply as possible into, yes, the subjective, yes, the lived experience. We focus on human interest journalism, narrative journalism, that uses the lives of people and what they're doing in order to illustrate the news, rather than tell you, hey, this happened, here and here. We introduce you to people, and by learning about these people and what they've gone through, you incidentally learn what the objective facts of the news are. The reason we've done this, and I think the reason why people have continued to read us, even though we're an independent journalism outlet that's only a year and a half old, is because there's something truthful about it, there's something authentic about it, there's something obviously connecting Ukrainian people who are undergoing what's happening and the atrocities of the war right now, and people thousands of miles away. I think the reason why there's some connection there is because it seems very obviously truthful and authentic. And that's where, if we give some credit to people, the reader, the audience, the viewer of documentary, we have to have a little faith in people to be able to demystify propaganda from truth. And I think even in Russia, there must be some voice in the back of the head that says, okay, this is a little bit out of line with the world that I live in. And this is really one of the big handicaps of autocratic societies that don't allow filmmakers to freely dissent, to freely show what people are going through, particularly the oppressed or the people who are struggling in society, because it does not represent everyone's reality around them. And the autocracies collapse when that happens. When people finally say, you know, the messaging that I'm getting from state cinema, from publicly supported news and government-run news, it just does not jive with what I'm seeing, what everyone around me is seeing, what my neighbors are seeing, what my parents are seeing, what my family is seeing. It just does not make sense. This is what leads to collapses in autocracies. And that's why, you know, our publication's motto is empathy and autocracy can't mix. That when you tell the stories of people and what they're going through, their suffering and their defiance of dictatorial control, something cries out in every person who reads authentic journalism that this cannot stand. That something must be done. Something must be done to right this terrible wrong. The truth is not being told. I think that sort of instinct lives in the vast majority of people. And I think that's why propaganda like this, the propaganda that we saw today, will always fall flat.
Do you think that this is for your, I'm fascinated by your perspective, because not only are you, acclaimed investigative journalist, but you've chosen to locate yourself in Kyiv right now. You've chosen to discuss war correspondency through this particular conflict as a starting point. Is that narrative journalism, that almost the closest thing to documentary in print are these personal stories that we're talking about? Do you think that is distinguish to me between how much faith you have in that objective journalism that you refer to and this narrative journalism. Do we need more of one to support the other? Are these symbiotic? That is where the gray area lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about objective journalism, what I really think you're getting at is what is the truth, right? What is the honest reality? And I think particularly when we're talking about things that are happening very, very far geographically from where you are, what we're really searching for is authenticity. And I don't think that subjectivity and objectivity are at odds with one another. I think we can use subjective experiences to illustrate the truth. I think that's very much the kind of fundamental of our news organization, is to try to show how people's experiences. I'll give you one example, classic counteroffensive story. We really wanted to get into this really very alarming fact to me, which is that South Korea has contributed more 155 millimeter artillery shells to Ukraine than all of Europe combined. But that's a figure and a fact that's it's an objective fact.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was we profiled these two women in Kyiv who became best friends because of their shared love for K-pop, their shared love for Korean cuisine and culture. And we used their story of their close friendship over Korean cultural diplomacy to get into these weightier topics of geopolitics, of South Korea's increasing interest in supporting Ukraine due to North Korea's support, material support, and now military support for Russia, by getting into the lives of these people and how they became best friends. There's no problem in mixing, or in fact enticing people into the objective by using spirit.
And I think we should turn over to the globe right there. Stories that humanize the aggressor or give the alternative to facts and events, or purport to represent a minority or a fringe perspective, they do make their way from pitches to our papers. And I wanted to know if you could briefly, and I realize it's a difficult question to encapsulate here, but can you comment on what happens when those types of stories, written from those perspectives, cross an editor's desk?
I would say, I personally haven't seen a lot of those stories cross my desk. We do use freelance journalists and local journalists in the pages of the Globe, but there's a very, very intense vetting process, really. I don't take people at their word that they're who they are, sorry, but I don't. So if I'm pitched, I would investigate who this person is and what they're telling me, and we do a lot of vetting of our sources. And on subjects like Ukraine, we do have our own journalists that work exclusively on that. Not exclusively, but they work on that, and we're not taking a lot of freelance. So I don't know if you're familiar with Mark McKinnon. Janice Dixon has covered Ukraine for us. We've had Eric Gregory there. So, when they're talking to people and they put a source in their story, someone's experience in Ukraine, sometimes people don't want their name used because they're afraid of possible repercussions, even if it's just internet trolling. They're afraid to have their name out there to be exposed to Russia and other bad actors. So sometimes we'll grant them anonymity, but they're people that our reporters have spoken to in the flesh often, or have been able to verify the identity of. So, that we're an evidence-based news organization, and we try to verify everything that we print, and I'm really not sure what you mean about them making their way to print, maybe in other publications, but
Yeah, I'm not.
yeah, no, I'm just, yeah, like, you do have to be careful, like, as a teacher.
Because it happens,
Well, as a
100%.
teacher, like, in particular, because I know a lot of young people, their first way into journalism is freelancing, and there is a tendency to want to take things from social media and to reach out to people on X and other platforms as a way of making contact and getting interviews. But, you know, I do emphasize to them, especially with like X, like, don't just retweet things that you think you agree with without really being sure of where that source material is coming from. Because it's so easy, like, for someone to, like, innocently but stupidly, right, retweet misinformation. And I think everybody, even who aren't journalism students, but everybody should be aware of that, or sharing videos on YouTube or and other platforms.
It seems such a basic tenet, obviously, to
Where people get emotional, right? And
Of
they
course.
see things and they feel the need to share. Like, just please, like, pause and take time and think and really kind of look at what it is that you're sharing.
So then I'm going to ask you another just tiny question. Then how can you report on misinformation or disinformation without amplifying that message?
Oh, I think it's extremely important that we report on it. And it's all in the way that it's reported, the context itself. I mean, we've started having a regular feature that's called Fact Check. And a lot of news organizations are building up this part of what they do. Like, they're hiring people who are data specialists, who are specialists with visuals. There's a way of, like, geolocating photos and videos through various methods, including satellite and Google Earth and other tools, so that we can actually see if this picture that's been offered online is actually a picture of what it says it is. Because a lot of times you'll see someone, and including Russian bots, I'm sure, tweeting a protest picture saying this is happening in wherever, Georgia, and it's a completely different protest from somewhere else in the world, and they've just subbed in a photograph. So, you know, these are skills that I'm hoping are being taught in journalism schools, but also mainstream media organizations are investing in this. So it's the context in which you present that. So it would be like the headline itself, how the copy that would go with the presentation of that picture. I think you have to show it so people can recognize it,
Okay.
but that doesn't necessarily amplify it, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess the risk then is when you show it, someone else is going to have that feeling about it, and that
I want to
amplification
retweet it.
happens.
Yeah, and they might not provide the context, but I don't know, like, I don't think you're doing anybody a service by not showing people what it is that they need to be wary of. So I guess we have to, like, as you said, we have to trust somewhat in people's, like, ability, the reader, to connect the proper dots.
So then, let's talk about that personal responsibility of trying to be rational and to have a diversity in sources of news that the individual consumes, which is really quite a tall order. True. Chris Alexander, what are cultural gatekeepers, or gatekeepers in general, getting wrong, or perhaps not understanding about Russia's current propaganda machine?
I don't think there's a systematic bias or failing. There's just a lack of experience and naivety. I think a lot of filmmakers, even editors, certainly government officials, have not dealt with propaganda on the scale we're seeing it now in their lifetimes. And it's coming at them not in the Nazi way or Soviet way or the Maoist way. It's coming in a new way that is not labeled Russia or North Korea, North Korean cyber attack when it hits you. It's coming there. Maybe someone in intelligence will tell you where it's coming from, but you have to know something about today's trends, which are different from the trends 6 months ago, or certainly 2 years ago. So what countries are succeeding on this? Cultural communities, general population, government, the ones that are teaching it, the ones that are learning lessons quickly. There's a NATO Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense in Tallinn, Estonia. Not because they put the most money on the table, but because people know they're the best. A small country, but incredibly resilient on this front. And that extends into the disinformation and propaganda world where they are countering things. Now, it's a bit easier in countries with unique languages, small linguistic pools, where there are more gatekeepers that only speak that language. And it's hard to get bots or, students in St. Petersburg working for the IRA to pump out Twitter postings in Swedish or idiomatic Latvian, even with all the technologies available. So they're defending themselves better. Their populations, because of civic education, I think, subscribe to more curated, edited, quality journalism, which keeps everyone strong. But the English-speaking world is a mess. We do not teach people about this enough. I mean, there are some schools, there are some school boards that are starting to do it, but if you look across the US, Canada, UK, and beyond, we're not good at it. Actually, probably Australia is a bit better, looking at Chinese propaganda. The Russian stuff, we're all behind the curve, as are Germany and France, which makes us vulnerable to attack. One other point, this is not going away. I mean, I lived in Russia in the 90s where there was some free media. There was certainly a group of neo-imperialists who wanted to go to war in Chechnya and security people who wanted back in power. They got Putin, they came back to power. But there was diversity. There were independent editors. There was hard-hitting investigative reporting in the 90s in Russia. Then I went back in 2000 and it shut down. And it shut down with the acquiescence and support of the whole Russian intelligence. Solzhenitsyn took them all to a theater in Moscow and said, Putin's the man. He's perfect. He's the new Russia. There was a laying on of hands, a blessing of this agenda of new imperialism, aggression, and propaganda. And it's still intact. And they are going to, Surkov, Putin's great cardinal, who's out of office at the moment, but still has a hand in this stuff. He said, we are messing with your minds in ways you don't even understand. And people laughed in 2019, dismissed him. It's true. We're just starting to see what the impact has been on our political debates, on our political spectrum. Every G7 country has a major party or parties that has been co-opted by Russia. I would say the Republican Party is one. I would say both the UK Labour and Tory parties have wings that are co-opted. Germany, France, Italy definitely have parties that are fully pro-Kremlin. That doesn't happen just by paying Marine Le Pen a bit of money. That's this huge effort to mess with our minds, polarize our electorates, and catch us with our defenses down. And we did not defeat this kind of propaganda in the 20s and 30s without fighting back with regulation and much more spending by our governments at that time to make sure people do actually see what's happening on the front in Ukraine. Who is the author of all these coups in Africa? The business models of private journalism, CBC as we have it, are not enough to tell that story and ensure that the middle holds, in my view, in our politics today.
I'm just going to harken back, Angela, to yourself as a professor of journalism. This discussion that we're having here, is it falling on innocent ears that have not heard it before in your classes of young people or people training to be journalists? Is this on the agenda? Is this on the curriculum, this discussion?
Yeah, it has been for a while. I would say, to Chris's point, since 2016, because it took a little while, but it was BuzzFeed really that dug into the Facebook advertising that was being done about Hillary, and there was one about the Pope. I can't remember all of the crazy videos, but the amount that was shared, and I don't even think like most mainstream media were really aware of it at the time, just how prevalent that was on Facebook. So I think after that and that expose, like I know myself, I took that as a model of something to teach, like to show them, like this happened and this is going to continue to happen, and you know, this is the kind of thing that we're up against. So yeah, I mean, we talk about it at Humber, but I'm sure other journalism schools must as well. I don't know.
Is your feeling optimistic that it's getting enough discussion?
It's somewhat optimistic. You know, journalism students are few, actually, unfortunately.
Well, that's very significant.
It's not really journalism students that are the ones that I worry about. It's just general education in the university system. Like anybody who is in the humanities should be, or anybody, even engineers, I don't know, should be taking some kind of media literacy. I hope it would be better if it happened in high school, but it needs to be on the curriculum for sure.
So we're kind of dovetailing into part 3 of the discussion before we hand it over to the audience. And that's really, you know, what can tactically, practically be done about propaganda today, because it is, as you've outlined, a completely different Bunsen burner. It's an absolute laboratory of new inventions seemingly all the time. Tim, we'll start with you. War is barbaric. You are in Ukraine. You are also privy to Russian casualties. You are clearly dedicated to showing the narratives, discussing the narratives of the Ukrainians and Ukrainians in their plight. Talk to us a little bit about, how can I put it delicately, how does your team and yourself report the facts with the context? Can you enforce context when you're discussing these? What is the approach of your team when it comes to those specific realities of war?
I'm thinking a lot about our conversations and the various answers we've had on the panel tonight, and I'm reminded of I was asked on a different panel recently, like if I had a magic wand and I could make one change in public policy or the world to make it a better place, you know, what would I do? And I think all of us have maybe some idea of how we improve the world around us. And I said, I was kind of talking a little facetiously, and I was talking probably to be provocative, but I'm kind of thinking, you know, I'm not sure if the internet and social media, as part of the internet, has been a net positive good in the world. And I said kind of jokingly, I think maybe we need a cleansing electromagnetic pulse detonated over the atmosphere of the earth to kind of reset us a little bit. But I think it's a joke, but in some ways, in all good jokes, there's a little level
grain of truth,
right? And what do I mean by that? We have really been corrupted by a false image of the world around us because we've become so absorbed in our electronics. And our electronics show us a version of the world that isn't real, and as we spend more and more time in our electronics, we're more convinced that that's, you know, more representative of the world around us than the things that we see with our own eyes when we're not on our electronics. And so what am I trying to get to? What is the antidote for a lot of this disinformation? It is, firstly, to step outside and talk to your neighbors, to go out and see the world around you and observe it with your own eyes, and to see what is authentic and what's not. I want to give a lot more faith in the viewers and listeners and readers and the people who are in our audience and other people around the world. I want to give a lot more confidence in those people that we can discern truth from falsity. And so part of the way that we try to create context and try to convey truth is to write journalism in a way that makes sense to everyone, that's super accessible to everyone, that's not so serious, that's much more about a human experience and much less about a super dry recitation of who, what, when, where, why. It's not the only way to do it, but the reason why I think it has gotten some purchase and some momentum is because it feels like something that has a deeper connection. It feels like something that we're missing. It feels like these authentic human stories are what we're not seeing when we open Instagram or we open TikTok and we see only the best versions of people's lives, which is in its own way propaganda. Not state-run propaganda, but kind of individual falsity. I think people are craving and understand instinctively what's false, what's not authentic. And I think let's give them a little credit for that and show human lives in all of its suffering and resistance and glory and tragedy. That's the kind of journalism we're trying to do, and I think that's why there's some greater level connection.
I know Angela said, about optimism. Is it possible? Is it on the rise? Is there any way that we can leave this room feeling good about the potential for us as individuals to have this critical thinking? And obviously, journalism such as that in the Globe and Mail has such a central role in that. Do you feel that a move towards including more narrative journalism is a positive step for large media outlets such as yourself and the others in Canada?
I think we need to find a way to connect with younger people who are gobbling up this personal journalism, but in a way that it's verified, right? Like, I think we could do a little better.
Not Twitter verified, but
but actually verified.
Yeah.
We could probably do a better job of how we present it, but still keeping the ethics that we have of verifying and checking our sources and having more than one source and all of that. It's the way it's presented. So I think we could do a better job at that. In a little bit of defense of the internet and social media, I mean, it has been a tool for the good when you think of citizen journalism and some of the wrongs that have been aired and shown that might not have made it through the gatekeepers, right? I'm talking about police body cam footage of events that has been shared on the media. Different rebel groups in the world, freedom fighters, if you will, have used it to share with other citizens their fight. So I don't think it's much more complex than saying that it's always a power for the bad. I mean, it has done some incredible good as well. So I think it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, before the internet, there's all kinds of different kinds of media that are available to people, like library books. And, we leave it up to the people that go to the library to choose what they're gonna read and read it, and absorb it and be smart enough to figure out what's truth and what's fiction. So I think it's the same with the internet. We have to have some trust in human reason.
I think it's important to absolutely, but it's important also to point out that, you know, the internet is not documentary, and documentary is not journalism. All three of those things share a lot of objectives and values, but they're not subject to the same ethical codes, codes of review, like, they are similar but estranged cousins at best. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, government's role. Is there one, Chris? We're going to turn to you for that. Does the government have a role in curating, obviously the internet, yes, but artistic expression, that subjective expression, at outlets like festivals, at outlets like this cinema? What is the role of government in your view?
Definitely has a role. I mean, last time we faced a major fascist threat, invasions of countries in Europe, the major European, North American jurisdictions decided to regulate broadcasting heavily, and to keep fascists and Nazis and Bolsheviks away from it. I mean, the system, the solution today with the internet is not going to be the same, but it needs to be bolder than it is. And governments definitely have a role to play in this. First, I would say in digital literacy, in giving people the tools to trust something and not trust it. I mean, trust in media is going down, as in government and politicians, is plummeting. Mostly because people are disoriented and confused in the ways that Tim has been describing. To create a virtuous cycle where the trust goes back up, people need tools to determine, to see what is useful and valuable and discard what is less so. I mean, the internet is a great thing. No one wants to abolish it or even regulate it more than necessary to fix big flaws. I mean, in Canada, I think a big flaw is that it's still available for hate speech. You know, it is illegal in this country to promote hate speech. You can do it, and you will have no consequences, and get a very loud loudspeaker, big one, at your disposal if you decide to do it here. Similarly, political advertising. We have very firm regulations. The Elections Canada can't even see the Facebook ads that we're all getting during the election cycle. They don't know who's paying for them. They're trusting that Meta Facebook is policing that, which they are not. So there needs to be more regulation in those kinds of areas. And then there needs to be a virtuous cycle. I mean, how does it work in Finland or Poland and Denmark, where there is less of a problem with this kind of polarization? Propaganda, when it is seen on a new website, on social media, somewhere else, is generally labeled. Not by the government, by civil society players that take this seriously. Then it is countered. Then there is a partnership, government, civil society, media usually, to prevent it from happening again, or at least happening at scale. We don't have that yet. And as a result, we have an attack surface for Russia and others who want to influence an American election or disorient Canadian political parties through the truckers' convoy. That is wide open to them. And we really, if we want democratic politics, moderate politics, we need to take that away from them. I think it's within the realm of regulatory possibility to say to platforms, you will pay a fine, a hefty one, if we find, in a confirmed way, using probably an arm's length body to monitor this, that hostile foreign actors have used your platform in a major way, as they were in this US election. I mean, that was happening in real time. If it happened 4 years before, and there were penalties, which won't happen in the US first, but could happen here, earlier, that could have made a real difference to the volume of this kind of disinformation that's out there. I also think we need to invest as governments in cultural institutions, the arts, media, more than we have been, because these hostile adversaries are investing at such a high level. You look at the amount that's gone into RT, not just Russian films, RT, all the dark arts that the Kremlin practices through social media. It's tens of billions of dollars a year, I would guess. The US, Canada, Europe have not invested to empower journalists and artists and filmmakers to tell the story that should be told so that we come together. Ukraine shouldn't be fighting alone.
The Conservative Party is now running on a platform where they're talking about taking money away from media like the CBC. So
I profoundly disagree with that proposal, and that's why I'm not part of
there
that.
anymore.
Part of that.
You're striking on something that needs to be underlined, and that yes, when government absolutely has a role in regulating the internet and the conversation that is subsidized by capitalism on the internet, but when it comes to arts and culture, this country does not support that. We are not in an arena where we welcome government control over artistic and cultural sectors. Now we can argue that what does that truly mean? What does that mean to democracy? And that's hopefully what the questions that we're going to turn over to now will get to. We have limited time, 10 minutes, but let's talk about that first question. Yes, right there.
All three of you have touched on something that I think is culminating in a number of ways, but I'm also a university professor, and so education is a focus of mine. So it's clear from everyone's discussion that recognizing propaganda, critically evaluating it, this is not a natural human process. It takes energy, it takes education to start with. So as citizens of a democracy, as citizens of a place that we want to consider free, at what point, and particularly with what we're about to see happen with Project 2025, at what point do we start looking at the defunding of education at all levels as a national security threat?
That is a serious question. We're talking about, I'm just going to condense it, looking at all of ourselves, elevating ourselves as responsible citizens and consumers of information and consumers of arts as well, is the defunding of academia, of universities, of education. Should this be considered under the umbrella of national security threats? That's really interesting. We're going to start with you, Tim, if you have a comment about that, because obviously we're talking from a Canadian education's point of view, but you are in a country whose education system has been really ravaged by information control.
Well, I think I'm going to have the more controversial answer on the stage.
Go for it, Tim.
But as someone who grew up in Canada, who went through the public education system in Canada, went to McGill, and then later worked in
Valedictorian of his class in the Guild.
But then worked for both private news organizations in the United States and NPR, which is at least partially funded, publicly funded news organization. I don't think that we need to teach people how to discern the truth from falsity in general. I don't think we need classes to do that. I don't think we need the government to teach us that. I don't think that the Soviet Union fell because Russian government officials included news literacy in their public schooling. No, because the reality around them did not align with the propagandistic worldview that was being preached to them by all sorts of government officials. I think it's much more simple than anything that needs to be taught in the classroom. I think most of us can discern the difference between a government pronouncement that just does not align with our reality and and something that does. And so I wouldn't be personally in favor of a mandatory truth-telling type of classroom exercise. I think, of course, people should diversify their sources of information, and they should talk to people who they disagree with and be open-minded. But I don't think we need classes for that. I don't think we need to go to school for that. And I don't think the government needs to manage that. I think most of us know how to do that already. I think we should give the public a little bit more.
Angela, should we? We all read the user comments.
I would slightly disagree with you. I mean, people, we're born with a certain amount of reason, and we're taught that just as humans living in the world. But I think the prevalence of the non-mainstream media, the prevalence of social media in some young people's lives, they haven't been exposed to the mainstream media as much as I grew up with, or perhaps you did too. I don't know your background, Tim, but the fact that they're going from in high school, they're being exposed to all of the stuff on social without maybe ever having read a newspaper, right? Or watched a cable news television show. Cable news is dying too, right? It's exposing them to different kinds of media that they wouldn't normally be getting in their own social lives, I think, is where the teaching part could come to play in this.
Just one quick point is
And just so there's no disinformation, when you call me a professor, I'm actually an instructor.
Instructor.
I'm not I don't have a PhD, I'm not a professor full-time or anything, just so I don't want it to come out later that I was just
my one small point is that none of the liberation movements of the 20th century or the pro-democracy movements of the 21st century required a mandatory news literacy class in order for people to understand that autocracy was not acceptable, was not doing good things for the people of those societies. And I don't think we do that either.
I want to make room for you, but I also just want to say that most people are young people. They're not reading books, they're watching documentaries instead. Or I would like to think they're watching feature-length documentaries, but they're watching 60-second clips as well. So I'm more cynical, I suppose. I want to make sure I make room. Yes, please.
Thank you for the discussion. It's very needed at this time. We know in Ukraine that there's a very large fifth column of Russian provocateurs and agents. Tim, I was going to ask you, in your experience in Kyiv in recent times, how has Ukraine been dealing with disinformation in a time of war and a genocide with an existential threat to the whole country?
So we're picking up on something we started to talk about earlier, is how are people in Ukraine dealing with this fifth column of invasion? How are they preparing themselves or combating against disinformation?
Well, I have to say, sadly, not very well, because as I was kind of referring to earlier, the Russian efforts at disinformation in Ukraine don't have a lot of similarities with the kind of overt propaganda that we saw in the documentary today. They involve radicalization of any kind for any reason to provoke violence. And
can you give us some examples, because people are just going to want to hear some
So actually, it's very personal for me because I have a very close friend who I had to disassociate from. This is a Ukrainian person who is like a brother to me. He's very close to me, And he got into some online groups that he thought represented his worldview, and these are Telegram groups that aren't regulated and can't be regulated. And the folks in these groups presented themselves as Ukrainian veterans. And this Telegram group slowly started to raise the temperature on the kind of language and the rhetoric in these groups, from merely patriotic to starting to get angry at the Zelensky administration, to the Zelensky administration has betrayed us, to we need to do something about it, to let's even organize acts of violence in Ukraine against the Ukrainian government. And my close friend was involved in this group. And what we later found out was that the entire Telegram group was instigated by a Russian source. And the way we found that is that the entire private Telegram group chat was leaked to a Russian newspaper. And including all the names and all the comments made. And so I had to disassociate from my friend who, despite being a Ukrainian patriot, went down this very dark pathway to the point where he was starting to talk about organizing overt acts of violence in Ukraine against Ukrainians because of how he got ginnied up by Russian propaganda and instigation. And what can the government do about that? I'm not sure they can do very much about that.
A lot.
I'll ask us to just perhaps close with a concluding statement from each of you, Tim. I think that is so fascinating and really the marrow of the discussion. I think you're not alone in this room where we've all had extremely difficult conversations with people who we are politically aligned with and have to disassociate with. This is part of our new reality as well. Chris, I'll let you have a final say.
I think citizens, young and old, everyone, have a right to know what our enemies are doing that affects us through our phones or through our uncle who's gone down that rabbit hole. We need to tell people about this in real time, not in an alarmist way, but I think it should be part of civic education in schools, in civil society organizations, led always by civil society, but it should be informed by real information because your friends do. If they knew that that was a Russian operative launching this discussion, would not have joined in. It only works when it's a covert operation where the instigator is bringing everyone in under false pretenses. I mean, QAnon, there's probably no one in this room who even follows it, but there are millions of Americans who have been affected by this cult. And the best information we have about QAnon is that Q, the person who's giving the orders behind the curtain, hasn't been identified, is a Russian intelligence officer.
Well,
and you can take this all across. It would have been nice to know during COVID that Russian information warfare operatives were investing heavily in anti-vax extremism. It would have been helpful during the BLM movement to know that part of that movement was being radicalized from Moscow, or that the Yellow Vest movement in France, which jumped into Canada and went into our truckers convoy, had a huge Russian imprint on it. When people know these things, it becomes less harmful immediately, and there's much more we can do beyond that.
so more information is the antidote. Empathy cannot coexist with authoritarianism. And John, I'll let you have the final say of what your prescription.
I think I would like to see more people engage with journalism and understand how expensive it is to have actual people reporting on the ground, which is to Tim's point of actually being there to see what's happening. I mean, the Globe has correspondents and we send people to places so they can actually just lay eyes on what is going on there. Be it the border of Mexico or the border of Ukraine and Moldova. And that's expensive, and people get angry because we have a paywall, but like we have to pay for it somehow, right? And it's not even just like paywall journalism, like just supporting journalism. There's all kinds of journalism being done. The Guardian does journalism, and you can donate to journalism. Just to realize that like it's kind of precious and it's in danger, and civic society like needs journalists out there to investigate some of this stuff. So
And needs narrative journalists and documentarians. I know that there are many more questions, and I would invite anyone with questions, if it's all right with us, to take our discussions outside. I also want to just, again, thank so much the organizers of tonight's event, because what we are participating in right now, this discussion, is really emblematic of everything that each of the three of you have said. It's a desire by private citizens to educate themselves, to hear a diversity of opinion, to be critical thinkers, and to exercise our right to protest when we feel that these ethics have been infringed on. And the ability to do this only happens in a country that defends the right to expression and thought. And so I thank the three of you for participating and being part of that dialectic here with us this evening. So I thank you both, all three of you, very much. And I thank you for the continued questions. And I know we'll have lots of talk outside. Thank you.